G'day YouTube! Welcome to the third video in the series on Plato and the last of the brief overview videos before we start getting into Plato in a little bit more depth and detail. So last time we finished talking about the middle dialogues, so we'll discuss the late dialogues now. Okay, so Parmenides and the Theaetetus, they are late, middle, or early late dialogues. And the Parmenides contains a pretty damaging criticism to Plato's theory of forms. As a result, this has thrown Plato's views or his later views into doubt. Okay, so we're not too sure what Plato's later views were, and these dialogues may suggest that Plato was shifting his views or changing his mind. Perhaps not, we don't really know. Perhaps what Plato was doing was considering objections to his arguments and trying to show that he wasn't being biased and closed-minded and was treating alternative views fairly. Okay, so you've all written essays in high school, and perhaps a teacher once told you to always include an objection to your argument in your essay, right? So Plato is probably doing the same thing here, I think. But the criticism is quite damaging, so why might that be? Well, just like nowadays, when you choose an objection to consider in your essay, you don't just pick any objection. Okay, it might be tempting to pick a poor objection or one that is easy to dismiss along the way to your conclusion. But this is actually a bad idea, and it can just raise some suspicion in the mind of the reader that maybe your argument can't meet some of the harder objections. If you pick what you think is the hardest one and dismiss it in a convincing way, then the weaker objections kind of fall by the wayside, so to speak. So imagine, you are the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, and the number one contender is Muhammad Ali, right? So we're going to paint an analogy here. So he's the one that everyone thinks has a shot at wresting the title from you. And if you want to keep your title and be the undisputed champion, you need to fight the number one contender. If instead you fought the number 3 contender, people are still going to think that the number 1 contender is a threat to your title, and perhaps even the number 2 contender can beat you as well. If you did fight the number 1 contender and you were victorious, then people are more confident that you can deal with all the other contenders lower down in the rankings. So it's a similar thing with considering an objection in an argument, and perhaps that's what Plato is doing in the Parmenides, and perhaps that's why it's such a damaging criticism. Of course, this may not be the reason, and maybe Plato was actually changing his mind. Moving on. So the Theaetetus is a brilliant investigation into the concept of knowledge, right? It's worth noting here that there are not many contemporary philosophers that would call themselves Platonists. Again, recall the distinction that I mentioned earlier between Platonism with a capital P and with a lowercase p, right? So not many contemporary philosophers would call themselves Platonists with a capital P. Okay? Many philosophers hold views that have been influenced by Platonism, though, but there aren't many Platonists. Plato's theory of knowledge, however, is an exception because you can take this theory and leave out all of the forms, the theory of the forms and all that kind of stuff, which seems a bit radical to the modern reader. And if you did this, you would still be left with something that's convincing to the modern reader, perhaps. So he introduces this account of knowledge as true belief plus a logos. So what's logos? That's an ancient Greek word, and it's sometimes translated as an account, right? But Plato really has in mind what we nowadays call justification. So logos means something like certification by reason or the justification for a belief, right? And this is partly this part of the theory actually gave rise to a very challenging problem in epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy that seeks to answer questions about knowledge, right? And that problem is known as the problem of the criterion, which I'll cover one day in an epistemology video series, okay? So nowadays, Plato's theory of knowledge is often called the JTB theory of knowledge. That's the justified true belief theory of knowledge. Not everyone accepts it. For example, a philosopher named Edmund Gettier raised some quite challenging problems with JTB theory. And we will discuss those problems either in this video series or perhaps in another video series on my epistemology video series. Probably the latter, so that I don't double up on content. But nowadays, Plato's theory of knowledge is often called the JTB theory of knowledge. Not everyone accepts it. But certainly it's still the most prominent and popular theory of knowledge in philosophy. So let's unpack JTB theory a little and think about why it might be a good set of criteria for knowledge. Okay? Well, let's start with the truth part. Is it possible to know that 1 plus 1 equals 3, even though it's not true? Doesn't seem like it. Okay, false statements don't seem like the kind of statements that we can know. What about belief? Well, is it possible to know that George Washington was the first US president without believing that George Washington was the first US president? It doesn't really make sense to think that if you don't think that it's true. It doesn't make sense to say something like, I know that I was born, but I don't believe it. Okay? If someone said that, I know that P is true, but I don't believe that P is true, we probably wouldn't interpret them literally and take them to be expressing perhaps their surprise about the proposition P. Okay? So why the logos? What about the J in JTB theory of knowledge, right? The logos is the justification part in the theory, the J. All right, well, this part's less straightforward, so perhaps it's easier to explain by considering an analogy. So if you haven't realized by now, I love analogies. Okay, so the Earth is approximately 380,000 kilometers away from the Moon, okay? So suppose I believe that proposition, and that proposition is true. It is in fact true. And suppose you believe it's true as well. So both of us can have different reasons or different justifications. In other words, a different logos for believing it to be true. So suppose you did some astronomical calculations and you busted out your telescope and you did some logarithms or something like that and concluded that the value for the distance between Earth and its moon was approximately 380,000 kilometers. I think it's about 384,000. But anyways, suppose on the other hand, I just went for a walk into the jungle and I eat some psychedelic mushroom and I have a hallucination where Mustafa from Disney's The Lion King, so that's Simba's dad in The Lion King, and he tells me that the Earth and its moon is about 380,000 kilometers apart. Okay, so your claim to knowledge in this scenario seems on firmer ground than mine, even though we both believe that it's the rough distance, and even though it's true that that's roughly the distance between the two objects. I mean, imagine if someone asked me how I knew that fact, and I told them that Mustafa from The Lion King told me. Okay, that person would be skeptical. All right, that's the kind of intuition that motivates the logos or the justification. Okay, so let's move on. The later dialogues, especially Laws, and that's the longest of all the dialogues. Okay, they tend to revisit the character of an ideal republic, which Plato initially introduces in the dialogue called Republic. Okay, Plato is very concerned with how we can live morally as individuals as well as a collective. Okay, but Plato approaches these issues in a less radical way than the Republic. Okay, the Republic will seem quite radical to the modern reader, and that's part of what makes it fun to read. Timaeus, on the other hand, is especially interesting as a scientific work because it's an early attempt at cosmology, and this echoed in what is now called Neoplatonism. Okay, Neoplatonism is like a fusion of Plato's philosophy with Pythagoras' philosophy. So it's a fusion of Plato's philosophy with religious, Pythagorean, and other classical doctrines originated by a later philosopher named Plotinus. So those Pythagorean doctrines, yeah, they come from Pythagoras. He's someone you've probably heard of. He's famous for a theorem, theorem in geometry. The length of a hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is the sum of the squares of the remaining two sides. Although he's not the first to know that result, even though the result bears his name. But anyways, Platonism had a huge influence on Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, as did the ideas of Aristotle, Plato's most famous student. Okay, so moving on. Plato is regarded as having invented the kind of philosophical argument typical of Western philosophy. Okay, so many would claim that the depth and range of his thought hasn't been surpassed, and both of these claims are of course debatable. But Plato is certainly up there with the greats, and he is still relevant today, even though his views are not widely accepted anymore, with the JTB theory of knowledge being an exception, right? So why would that be? Why is he still relevant? Well, to say that Platonism is not widely accepted now just means that we've rejected his answers, okay? That doesn't mean the questions don't still stand, okay? If we've rejected his answers, that just means that the questions are still there. They still stand. So if you cast your mind back to one of my previous videos where we talk about negative and positive work in the early dialogues and middle dialogues respectively, this means that we are in some sense just carrying on the work of the early dialogues and are doing negative work, the negative work of the early dialogues, and that's what we're doing when we tend to reject Plato's views nowadays. So the positive work still has to be done. Okay, this kind of challenges us to supply our own version of the middle and late dialogues, because their task was to provide answers to the kinds of questions raised in the early dialogues. Okay, so we are challenged to do something that achieves some positive work to answering those questions, and indeed much of the history of Western philosophy is attempts to answer questions originally raised by Plato and others, of course. But this is summed up by a famous quote from Alfred North Whitehead, who was a mathematician and philosopher. I think I mentioned him last video. And he said, he had a quote about Plato, and I won't get the quote verbatim, but it's more or less to the effect of all of Western philosophy is really just a series of footnotes to Plato, okay? And I think that's a good place to leave it for now. And this is the last of the overview videos on Plato. So all of the videos henceforth in the series are going to get deeper and more detailed. And in the next few videos, we are actually going to look at how philosophy comes about in ancient Athens, even though it's not really true in one sense to say that philosophy originated in ancient Greece. And it's not really true to say that philosophy originated in the West either, okay? But Athens is where philosophy underwent a systematization into variously categorized different schools of thought, right? And I'm going to talk about the pre-Socratics. Those are the philosophers that predate Socrates, and I'll even talk about how they come about before there is anything like philosophy in this region, okay? I have an idea for telling this story a bit like a story which is analogous to Darwin's theory of evolution. So, by the way, I'm not suggesting there that Darwin's theory is just a story. That's not what I meant. So stay tuned for that. And if you like this video, hit the like button. That's why it's there. And subscribe to see more content, and perhaps share the video with a friend. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Goodbye for now.